Hi, so now we're getting started with Paulo Freire on Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And a bit about Paulo Freire, who was a very influential Brazilian theorist. He was born in 1921, passed away in 1997. In 1964, when he was working as a professor of history and philosophy in Brazil, he was imprisoned for subversive teachings. And one of the things that we're going to be thinking about, so when we're thinking about pedagogy of the oppressed, teaching from the oppressive view, it becomes a challenge to power. And where we're thinking as political science thinkers and students, we're always centered on that notion of power. So that's always our key concept, our key understanding of how we're reading each and every thinker or idea that we're engaged in, or law or policy in society. So, why is one imprisoned for teaching? That's a fundamental question. And as we're going to be moving, we're going to be raising these issues throughout. So, here's an image of Paulo Freire. And Freire understands the role of power in our everyday life. From his perspective, he's seen how power is maintaining systems of inequality, structures of inequality based on class, based on gender, based on race, and based on different positions that people occupy in human society, and namely in his native Brazil, right? So to be a student, for Freire, to be a college student, or a student at any level, it is to engage in that realm of power contestation. And he says that washing one's hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. And this is very profound as we're thinking here in our moment in 2020, how we are engaged in a political, social, and economic confrontation, not only in the United States, but the world over. And to remain neutral, say, well, it doesn't affect me, or you can't do anything about it, um, that is precisely serving the ruling class. That's what Freire is telling us. There is no neutrality. You have to pick a side. And if your side is to side with the powerful, then you can make that explicit through an academic um, interrogation of why that is so, and or if you choose to side with those who lack power, who are being denied their humanity, then you engage in a different manner, right? But the fundamental truth that comes out is the forces are made explicit in society. We see that today. If there's so many examples, right? So if you're thinking in sport, the sports world is taking a stand, and there are those who are fundamentally now coming out and opposing that stand for a certain dignified humanity. So, and this is where this development that occurs in pedagogy, in teaching, and pedagogy simply means to teach, to teaching. This concept in Portuguese, conscientização, right? Which we find on page 35, which is in the footnote. It's a learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions and to take action against the oppressive elements of reality. And here I have an image of how we reflect, we theorize, and we act in the world. Theory and praxis. So political philosophy, social theory is not just simply theory. Right? It is how we act it out in the everyday world, and how things that work or don't work we reflect upon, and then we make them better. That is precisely what political theory does for us. It guides us, it gives us an understanding, and it leads us down a road of successes or mistakes, and how we gain certain advantages in that the daily act. So how do we get to the root of problems? And you mathematicians, I mentioned, and I always mention, we must be radical thinkers, right? We don't, as college students, we don't engage at the level of opinion. We don't engage at the level of superficiality. We engage in profound introspection into certain issues or ourselves, introspection, or reflection on certain things, or interrogation of a particular problem that we have to unearth. And for that, I always use this didactic tool, thinking about how we're using a radical sign to get to the root of the problem. Right? It's something to think about that we always have to apply. And this takes work. And so when we're thinking of this, when Paulo Freire is using the notion of radicalization, this is what he's saying. To radicalize is to be engaged in life-making possibilities. How do we become creative again? Because he's acknowledging and making very clear, coming from his standpoint, being imprisoned, right? That's pretty extreme for teaching into human beings to think critically, to ask questions of the powerful. And for that, he is imprisoned. So you must get to the root of the problem as thinking, why is that so? That upsets something. So radicalization for Freire is nourished by a critical spirit. It is always creative, criticizes, and thereby liberates. So criticism and critical inquiry or critical theory is a way to ask those fundamental questions. You can't just, we don't memorize, right? We're going to get to that a little bit later. We think critically. And as we're working through, our coursework and our text, we're always engaging everything we read through a critical lens. So if you want to understand what's happening in the world right now around us, we might turn off the TV, right? We have talking heads that are telling us something, and sometimes when we hear them, it's pure noise. It's not much that is really engaged with historical fact or sets of ideas or competing theories. It is how they believe that their opinion, and they have a platform to state it. Right? So to engage in the process of liberation, he or she or they cannot remain passive in the face of the oppressor's violence. This is that no neutrality stance, just to make that clear. So when power is confronted, there is no standing on the sidelines and watching the game play out. This is a moment of reckoning in our own nation now, where it's kind of a pretty easy choice. You can side, the sides are made clear, right? And that's kind of one of the good things, that in order for this nation to move forward, that confrontation is occurring. And one side will be relegated to the past, to historical ashes, to the historical memory, similar to the Confederacy, or those who supported Jim Crow, or those who still want to support a new way of Jim Crow in 2020. But we hold out the hope that liberation, for all human beings in the United States, will occur. And what is radical pedagogy? Radical pedagogy, or radical teaching, as we're thinking, or liberatory teaching, encapsulates all of these, right? It encapsulates you, where I value what you have to say, if we were in the classroom or in your writing, and I'm learning from you. It is decentering my positionality as a professor with a PhD, not above all of you. Right? I place myself on an equal plane and sit in that room. Normally, when we're teaching, I try to really disrupt the room, the architecture of the space, where you all sit in rows and you just write down what I'm saying, and then I give you a test and you give it back to me, and that's it. And I'm the expert, so I'm the one who gives you the grade. I don't give grades, you earn them. That's what I always say. But we sit in a circle, in a collective circle. We learn collectively. It is not a narrow confines to, say, political science. I incorporate other disciplines into my study, from philosophy, from history, from ethnic studies, which has so much to tell us about this moment right now, which is being, again, by the powerful, placed off to the margins. Right? And we'll talk a little bit about that. It is democratic, participatory, and it does require change, and it incorporates all of us as equals. So it is very egalitarian. And that's the form that begin when we begin to think and see beyond the forms that we were taught. K through 12 in the United States, if you went to a public institution or a private institution, similar curriculum, similar stories coming from one particular subjectivity, but with a goal in mind. And we're going to get to that, right? So as we're thinking about subjectivity and objectivity, these notions of I am what do I have to say? There is an objective truth and there is a subjective truth with a small t. What Freire tells us is this is a dialectical unity that produces knowledge in solidarity with action and vice versa. So it is the subject taking on that form, that universal form of freedom to engage and to become part of it. It is that dialectic. The dialectic is simply the opposition, the dialogue that is engaged by those two. And that's on page 38. But one thing that's fundamental, as we're mentioning power, how power plays a role, and plays a role in everything we see, read, see, hear, or do, or act in the world. Right? But that dehumanization, and we see dehumanization the world over right now, right? It marks not only those whose humanity has been stolen, but also, though in a different way, those who have stolen it. It is a distortion of the vocation of becoming more fully human. So this struggle is possible only because dehumanization, although a concrete historical fact, is not a given destiny, but the result of an unjust order that engenders violence in the oppressors, which in turn dehumanizes the oppressed. So what Freire is telling us, and what we see by those who study dehumanization or human rights, or when thinking, we can even make sense of that very simply. If we accept the dehumanization of any population, we become less human. Because we have already accepted an order or a hierarchy of humanity as almost natural. Those are criminals, those are illegal aliens, right? That's a form of dehumanization at the highest level that's produced through lawmaking. But if a society accepts those categories of difference among human beings, we who believe ourselves to be the higher order or the higher ranked level of humanity, because we might have a paper document that says so, are less human for doing that, right? And so in the world over, we see politicians utilizing forms of dehumanization to get to the White House successfully in 2016, or in Poland, or throughout the world. This is occurring. There's a way, or in Brazil itself now, where you have somebody who dehumanized and was very successful. So how do we become fully human? How do all lives begin to matter in this day and age in 2020, when not all lives have ever mattered? I'm taking the mantra, the example that is existent today, because that's very relevant, right? If we look at Black Lives Matter, they have been a dehumanized population in the United States since that moment in 1619, when the first black bodies were brought up into the U.S. territory, into the Americas, not the U.S., into the Americas against their will, in order to produce capital for those who were carrying them over. So they were never, and continue not to fully matter, to fully be human, and they are making a call for that today. Right? So that is a very prominent example. I mean, we know black bodies, brown bodies, and other racialized or gendered or sexualized bodies do not matter fully. And that translates itself into a social, political, and economic hierarchy in the United States. But so Freire, and the reason we're beginning to think about, because we need to unlearn what the nation-state educational system has given us as an absolute or objective truth, right? So we're going to interrogate that as we move forward. And I'm going to pause here for a moment, and I will begin part 2 of Freire, because this is very important. So let's just take that food for thought as we move to part two.